The entire case hinged on a single chilling question. What is the precise weight of $96 million in familial betrayal? The name at the center of this storm was Noel Quincy. And the stage for this tragedy, as I pieced it together from witness accounts, was an inheritance dinner. An evening where every glance, every silence was saturated with an almost unbearable anticipation. Then the patriarch finally broke that silence, speaking the words that would detonate the family's foundation. I can almost see it, him raising a crystal glass, a predatory smile aimed not at Noel, but at his other son. The younger brother Ben, a prodigal who had been back in the family's orbit for a scant 4 weeks. The decree was absolute, a clean sweep, everything the company, the houses, the accounts. A staggering $96 million in total assets, a kingdom built over a lifetime. It now belongs to Ben. The words hung in the air, a verdict delivered without a trial. The matriarch's approval was a second blow, sharp and immediate. He deserves it more than you ever did. A ripple of applause went through the room, the sound of complicity. But Noel's reaction was not what they expected. He rose from his chair not with anger, but with a terrifying calm, and began a slow, deliberate walk to the head of the table. And there he laid out 4 objects, 4 pieces of a puzzle I was now tasked to solve. The first clue, old creased documents, a medical and financial power of attorney. A ghost of a memory from a time when he and his mother were so vulnerable. They had signed them over years ago when their own hands lacked the strength to even hold a pen. The second and third clues were laid down with a soft click, the keys to the house and the keys to the safe. Symbols of access and trust now surrendered. The final piece was a thick, heavy envelope, its contents guarded by a seal of stark red notary wax. Noel's eyes, I'm told then, locked onto his brother, a gaze that held the weight of years. A single word escaped his lips, dripping with an irony no one there could yet comprehend. Congratulations. Then, a turn, a straight back, and a steady walk towards the grand exit, leaving a deafening silence in his wake. The father let out a dismissive chuckle, a fatal underestimation of his eldest child. He must have believed it was just a dramatic flourish, a petulant goodbye note for the theater of it all. He broke the red wax seal with an arrogant flick of his thumb, a public display of his victory. He did it right there before the eyes of 20 relatives and his oldest, most powerful friends. His gaze fell upon the document inside, scanning the contents with a smug curiosity. He absorbed the first line. His expression faltered. He read the second. And that's when the illusion of control shattered. The crystal glass slid from his numb fingers, exploding against the polished hardwood floor. A strangled gasp was the only sound he could make. You've got to be kidding me. Are you kidding me? The words weren't spoken. They were detonated, a roar that slammed into the tabletop. I can almost feel the shockwave, see the porcelain plates leap as if startled by the sudden violence. Then, a different sound pierces the air, his mother's scream, a thin, sharp shriek of disbelief. This is insane! And Ben, the report says simply, froze. In that frozen moment, every gaze in the room, like a magnetic force, swiveled to find him the one who was already in motion. He was walking away, and in that act he poses a question to the void, a question I see echoed in so many cases. He asks if you've ever poured your entire soul into something only to be told it was worthless. It's a call for witnesses, a digital gathering of a tribe asking them to mark their location on the map of shared pain. Because in his mind, the answer to that question is everything. What unfolds from this point forward is his thesis, his proof for why the world should never underestimate the quiet one. He's building his case, and he needs you to see every piece of evidence. The timeline begins 5 years prior. The file opens on a life that feels like a different person's entirely. The setting, Seattle. The life, a carefully constructed dream. His title was Senior Software Engineer. He was a rising star inside a health tech unicorn, one of those fabled startups poised to change the world. The numbers are precise, a testament to the value he held in income just shy of $300,000 a year. He wasn't just a coder, he was a leader steering a 12-person artificial intelligence team. They were on the verge of a Series C funding round, a critical moment of validation and expansion. His calendar from that time reads like a blueprint of success, a packed schedule of investor dinners and keynote invitations. And then the pivot point. It always comes down to a single, ordinary moment, a Tuesday morning. The call came at 5:47 a.m. Pacific Time. The precision of that time is etched into his memory, a digital tombstone. The voice on the other end wasn't a friend or colleague. It was the charge nurse from the Mayo Clinic. The location, Rochester, Minnesota, a world away. The message was clinical brutal. His father had collapsed. It happened at the office, the very place he'd dedicated his life to. The diagnosis, a massive ischemic stroke. As the nurse spoke, they were already rushing his father into the sterile theater of emergency surgery. By the time his flight touched down at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport a mere 4 hours later, it was too late to say goodbye to the man he knew. His father was submerged in a medically induced coma. Life was no longer his own. It belonged to the rhythmic sigh and whir of the machines breathing for him. The universe, it seems, wasn't finished. Just 2 days after that first cataclysm, his mother went to the doctor. She believed it was a simple case of bronchitis, a common ailment, a minor inconvenience. The diagnosis that came back was a second thunderclap stage 3 lung adenocarcinoma. There was no pause, no time to process. The relentless march of treatment began the very next Monday. The case file notes a precipitous physical decline, a loss of 32 pounds in a mere 6 weeks. It reads less like a symptom and more like a body consuming itself from the inside out. Then, a detail that anchors the clinical data in stark reality: he could barely lift a coffee cup. A simple act, now an impossible feat signifying a total systemic collapse. The response was not a decision, but a reflex. Indefinite unpaid leave declared that very week, followed by the stark image of 2 packed suitcases. He sublet his Capitol Hill apartment, a detail that whispers of a desperate hope to return a fragile tether to the life he was forced to abandon. The destination was a full regression back to the childhood bedroom in Edina. It wasn't just a change of address, it was the erasure of his adult identity. The company he left behind in Seattle offered the standard hollow platitudes. Their words were a performance of compassion. Take all the time you need. They said, a phrase designed to sound benevolent but meaning nothing. The truth of his replaceability was delivered with brutal efficiency. His position was filled in 9 days. A career, a life's chapter overwritten in less than a fortnight. He describes that first year as a loop, a term that perfectly captures the monotonous, inescapable trauma of his new existence. The sensory details paint a portrait of a personal hell: the constant humming glare of fluorescent hospital lights and the pervasive sterile smell of antiseptic. His world shrank to the dimensions of a single room, his bed a cold vinyl recliner, a throne of sleepless, anxious vigil. The number is staggering. He slept in that chair in his father's ICU room for more than 300 nights. He wasn't a visitor, he was a permanent fixture of the crisis. Then, the chronicle of his field promotion. He learned to suction his father's tracheostomy tube, an intimate and terrifying procedure born of pure necessity. He stepped into the role of a trained nurse when the actual night nurse was stretched too thin, a symptom of a larger systemic failure. His skill set expanded into pharmacology, mixing his mother's chemotherapy at home, a delicate, dangerous dance with toxic chemicals on the kitchen counter. The reason is a familiar story of a broken system. The home health agency was short-staffed, forcing an untrained son to take on life-or-death responsibilities. And here, a chilling testament to his forced expertise, a detail that speaks volumes about the darkness he was operating within. By month 8, he could start an IV in the dark. He had adapted, becoming a nocturnal medic in the trenches of his family's private war. A breakthrough: his father finally emerged from a 6-week coma. But this victory was immediately shadowed by a new, devastating loss. The stroke, he says, stole his father's speech, a personification that casts the event as a malicious thief, leaving a void for 8 solid months. Communication was reduced to the most primitive binary language. A simple nod had to convey a universe of meaning. Their entire relationship, all nuance and history, was compressed into a desperate Morse code: 2 squeezes of the hand for yes, 1 for no. Meanwhile, his mother's hands shook so violently, a physical manifestation of the family's trauma, that she was robbed of a fundamental piece of her identity. She couldn't even sign her own name. The very act of affirming her existence was now impossible. At this point, the crisis shifts from the medical to the bureaucratic with the arrival of the hospital social worker and their estate attorney. The narrative becomes cold clinical. Minnesota law is clear. The ambiguity of illness gives way to the rigid certainty of legal statutes. The situation is laid bare: with both parents legally incapacitated, a power vacuum had been created that the state was obligated to fill. Someone had to be granted medical and financial power of attorney, a complete transfer of his parents' autonomy into another's hands. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air: if he didn't take control, the state would. The family would lose everything. And so they both signed the documents, a final, heartbreaking act of surrender, officially making their son the custodian of their lives. The document is dated that same afternoon, and the signature, it's not a signature at all, just a series of shaky X's. I see the official attestations here witnessed by 2 nurses and a notary public, their own signatures crisp and professional. They were summoned, the report says, to the neurofloor where that feeble mark on the page was made. And just like that, it legally made her the acting CEO of Quincy Medical Supply. A sudden coronation, but the fine print reveals a hollow crown. There was 0 paycheck attached. She was only 30 years old then, suddenly shouldering a 90-person operation. A company that built the very machines of life support ventilators, things to help people breathe, and portable X-ray machines to see what's broken inside, all while she was the one physically pushing her own mother's wheelchair down sterile corridors to radiation therapy every single morning. The duality is staggering. By day, a caregiver. By night, her testimony states she taught herself corporate finance. Her textbooks were YouTube tutorials and dense SEC filings studied under a single lamp. At 2 in the morning, in the crushing silence that descended after the night nurse had clocked out. In those stolen hours, she was signing vendor contracts, she was approving payroll. She was going to war negotiating with the monolithic insurance giants. And the whole time, her only audience was her father, his gaze fixed on her from his hospital bed. He couldn't form the words, but she describes his eyes how they held a silent, profound apology. A deep sorrow for the burden he couldn't yet voice. And here the story splinters. A second crisis was unfolding concurrently involving her younger brother, Ben. The words she uses are absolute. He had vanished off the face of the earth. The last known trace places him in Phoenix, caught deep in the grip of an opioid dependency. The file notes the origin point, a back injury, a simple accident on a construction job. It led, as it so often does, to an arrest. The charge was possession with intent. I'm noting the timeline here. This was 18 months before the father's stroke. This family was already under siege. The Arizona court system presented him with an ultimatum, what they framed as a choice. Option 1, a 12-month mandatory stay in a residential rehabilitation facility. Option 2, prison. He chose rehab. He chose the door that looked like an escape. But that program, it had a strict policy, a total communications blackout with family. And for the initial 6 months, a mandated silence. And after that period of silence, he simply never called again. The silence just continued. In response, her mother began a vigil. She kept his bedroom perfectly preserved, untouched, a time capsule of grief as if he were due back any day. A convenient fiction, away at college, a placeholder for the truth they couldn't face. He had simply vanished. The case file notes a lack of pursuit, but the reason wasn't apathy. It was triage. There was no time to search for one lost soul. Every transaction, every single dollar was a desperate calculation, a choice between survival and collapse. It was about keeping the factory humming, a fragile heartbeat, and funding a hope that medicine could provide. The mother's treatment, experimental immunotherapy. A roll of the dice with a life on the line. The system pushed back hard. Insurance denied the claim not once but twice, a death sentence on letterhead. But this sibling fought. They became a warrior, drafting appeals with the precision of a lawyer. The records show a flight to Chicago, a face-to-face confrontation with the gatekeepers of life and death. Meanwhile, another battle raged at home. The father, silenced by his condition, began the slow climb back with speech therapy. 14 months. It took 14 months for him to reclaim 2 words, thank you. A whisper that sounded like a roar. Then, a breakthrough. The mother's scans revealed a retreat of the disease, the first sign of progress. For a fleeting moment, the narrative allowed for hope, a belief that the relentless storm was finally breaking. A false dawn. The statement reads, I was wrong. A chilling premonition of the hardship yet to come. That corner they thought they were turning was a mirage, still 3.5 years down a brutal road. The timeline then jumps to a precise moment, 7 in the morning. A doorbell rings sharp and intrusive. I can picture the scene, the narrator submerged in payroll reports, a soldier in their own trench. The exhaustion is a physical presence in the testimony, 31 hours without sleep. A state of pure, frayed nerve survival. They opened the door and reality shifted. The cold coffee mug in their hand, a relic from a world that existed seconds before. And there he was, Ben, the ghost. Standing on the porch, returned from the void. His only possession was a faded army duffel, a clue to a life lived on the margins, a life of transit. The physical transformation was stark. Thinner, stripped of the facade he used to wear. And his eyes. The report highlights his eyes. Clear, for the first time since he was 17. The haze was gone. This was not the boy who left. This was a man who had survived something profound. His explanation was delivered like a field report. I finished the program. 14 months clean. The college story evaporated, replaced by the stark truth of court-ordered rehab in Arizona. He hadn't run away. He'd been sent away. He'd been out for 3 weeks, a 21-day gap in the timeline. Where was he during that time? The mother's reaction was primal. From the kitchen in her robe she saw him, and her own fight was forgotten. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand an explanation. She simply saw her son, and she collapsed into his arms, the sobs of a parent who thought they were burying their child, not welcoming him home from his war. The relief was so immense it had to be shared. Within the hour, she was on the phone, rewriting the family history with the truth. It was a summons, not an invitation, to every relative within a 100-mile radius. By noon, the air in the house was thick with the scent of cinnamon, a deliberate, cloying sweetness. It was the smell of manufactured warmth of second chances being baked into existence. And that very same afternoon, the campaign of historical revisionism began. I watched as my mother positioned my father in his recliner, the family throne, and began to deliver the new scripture. Her voice was pitched just so a performance loud enough to carry down the hallway where I stood the intended audience. The first lie was poetic. Ben had been on a quest, finding himself somewhere out in the mythic West. He hadn't been lost, you see, he had been exploring. He'd been networking with suppliers in Phoenix, she announced, adding a layer of corporate legitimacy to the fantasy. And for the final flourish, he'd supposedly enrolled in online business courses, a phantom certificate of redemption. I could practically feel the friction as every ugly, inconvenient truth was methodically sanded away, leaving behind the gleaming artificial surface of a brand new story. By the time dinner was served, the official family doctrine had been ratified. The past was erased. Ben had never struggled with addiction. No, he'd simply been an ambitious entrepreneur in a period of intense off-site training. The very next day he strode into the company headquarters, a ghost returning to his own haunting. He walked with a borrowed confidence while my mother marched him, the conquering general, directly to the executive floor, bypassing the years of work and memory. She presented him to the leadership team not as a prodigal son but as a prophecy fulfilled. He was, she declared, the future of Quincy Medical Supply. I saw the COO, a man named Mark, whose entire career was built on the foundation I'd laid, on the fact I'd kept the lights on for 5 long years, step forward. He took Ben's hand not as an equal but with the deference one shows to royalty. And then, the first act of tribute, he asked the new prince if he wanted the corner office repainted to his liking. A mere 3 days later, the purge began. My login credentials failed. I made the call to IT already knowing the answer. The script they read was clinical. The COO himself had ordered a full password reset, citing security reasons. I understood the translation perfectly. The one person who knew the truth was now the primary security risk. My access was terminated. Then the silence grew. Board meeting invitations vanished from my calendar, my name erased from the future. And here, the official record of his demotion arrives, a silent, empty inbox. His father's response when questioned is a study in resignation. A simple shrug, a verbal surrender. He says, "Your mother decided." And in that moment, the true power structure of the family is laid bare. It was time for Ben, the favored son, to take control. But the father's next words are a quiet act of rebellion, a ghost's protest. I kept showing up anyway. It paints a picture of a man haunting his own life, slipping past the new regime. He'd used the factory entrance, a back door into his own empire, arriving before the sun to avoid detection. His new office. A forgotten cubicle on the 3rd floor, a dusty relic from a time when he still mattered. A space no one claimed because in their minds it was already occupied by a ghost. From this outpost he fought a silent war, proving purchase orders that were intentionally left hanging, a deliberate administrative limbo. He'd catch pricing errors, subtle mistakes that were either incompetence or sabotage. I'm not sure which is worse. These weren't small slips. These were calculated blunders that would have cost the company well over 6 figures. He sent out digital flares emails pleading for reason for sanity, all of which vanished into a carefully constructed void. Then the night shift, his second life. He'd drive back to a silent house, a place that no longer felt like home. The microwaved lasagna becomes a ritual of solitude, fuel for the real work that began when the family slept. His laptop screen glowing until dawn, a modern-day forge where he hammered out lines of code. He was building something from nothing, an entirely new reality that the inhabitants of that house were completely oblivious to. Meanwhile, the performance of the new king began. Ben started commandeering the conference room, a daily ceremony of power held in the very space his brother had once commanded. It was a calculated insult. He'd stand there in pristine shirts, each one a testament to their mother's tireless support ironed to perfection. He spoke in a borrowed language, repeating corporate buzzwords he clearly didn't understand. Words like synergy, as if he could force unity through jargon alone. Vertical integration. Disruptive growth. Empty phrases from a hollow man propped up by ambition that wasn't his own. The loyalty of the court shifted predictably. The employees who once brought our subject coffee now served his usurper. And the few who remembered him, the ones who still held some shred of loyalty, their acknowledgments were fleeting furtive nods in the hallway, their eyes fixed on the floor. A clear signal. They understood that any association with the deposed prince was a risk to their own survival. The Queen Mother wasted no time solidifying her son's new status. She redecorated his old bedroom that very first weekend. It was a complete transformation, a new mattress, a new desk, the furnishings of a future executive. She strategically placed framed photos not of his recent life but of a past glory, a time when he was the high school quarterback. A constant reminder of the golden boy she was determined to resurrect regardless of the man he'd become. And on his door she hung the final proclamation, a sign that read, Ben Future, leaving the title unspoken but its meaning hanging in the air like a death sentence. CEO. I read the word on the door, and it's not just a title, it's a verdict. Passing it, she must have felt the very architecture of her life constricting around her. And then there's the father. His recovery wasn't just physical. It was a reclamation of power, beginning with his voice now capable of shaping short, sharp sentences. And the first name he speaks with this renewed authority, Ben's. His opinion is suddenly the new currency solicited on every matter from inventory ledgers to the potential of new product lines, even the strategic decision of whether to bid on the lucrative Coleman regional contract. This is a calculated shift, a public transfer of trust. And each time she attempted to interject her own experience, the mother would intervene. The smile is a fascinating detail, a mask of maternal warmth concealing a cold, strategic dismissal. "Let your brother handle it, honey." The words are a quiet blade coated in condescending affection. "You've done enough." Not praise, but a final command. And so she ceased the struggle, retreating. A simple nod, a surrender, as she returned to what she calls her shadow workstation. From there, she was the silent engine, the unseen force that kept the entire enterprise from collapsing, all while they orchestrated a grand celebration, a victory parade for a phantom, the prodigal son who had been absent for the duration of the entire fight. Then comes the night of the ceremony. A chandelier illuminates the dining room not as a home, but as a showroom. And there, 22 pristine place settings are laid out gleaming under sterile white linen. The sounds are all part of the performance, polished silver chiming against fine crystal as the hired staff moves among them, pouring the second offering of champagne. It's a scene of manufactured triumph. The guest list is a map of their power structure. Everyone who held sway in their small but formidable Minnesota empire had been summoned. There were the uncles, the old guard who still occupied seats on the board, the cousins whose dealerships formed the arteries of the business, the father's oldest golfing partners, and for good measure the family minister to sanctify the proceedings. And there he was, the patriarch positioned at the head of the table, dressed in a midnight blue suit, a costume she notes selected by the mother just that morning. The final detail she provides is the most telling: his voice. It had grown stronger over the last year. He was no longer a convalescent, he was a king. My eyes catch a detail in the report, a microphone pre-positioned with cold intentionality. The phrase, "just in case," hangs in the air. This wasn't a family meal, it was a staged tribunal. Then the father's performance begins, his glass rising, not for a simple toast but like a scepter. I read the words, "pass the torch," and I understand it's not about legacy, it's about erasure. A transfer of the entire kingdom to the one deemed worthy, the one who had proven himself. He belonged at the helm. The script was written, and the father turned to deliver the final act. A hand placed on Ben's shoulder. In that single gesture, a public coronation was complete. Noel's account notes the brother's grin, not one of surprise, but of meticulously rehearsed triumph. The detail is chilling, practicing in the mirror for weeks. This was a role he had studied and perfected. Then comes the legal execution, delivered with the casual air of a dinner conversation. I signed the final documents. The father lists the spoils of war, $96 million in company equity. The number itself is a weapon. The litany continues the real estate, the holdings, each asset, another stone ceiling, Noel's tomb. The investment accounts, a sweeping inventory of a life that would no longer be his. Everything now belongs to Benjamin. The name echoes, followed by the sound of complicity. A ripple of applause, not of genuine celebration, but of consensus. They were all witnesses to the verdict. A sharp whistle cuts through the noise. Aunt Linda's tears, were they for the victor or the vanquished? She dabs her eyes with a monogrammed napkin, a small civilized gesture in a moment of profound savagery. And then the mother's move. Her hand, reaching for her favored son's, a conduit of fierce, possessive energy. Noelle highlights her knuckles, turning white. This isn't maternal pride, it's the grip of a conqueror claiming her prize. Her gaze then finds Noel, a sniper's scope, cutting across the table over the perfectly roasted lamb. The sensory detail is a masterstroke of cruelty, the aroma of rosemary, the sight of a smile described as both sweet and utterly cruel. A smile that carried a silent, venomous judgment across the battlefield of the dining table. The words hung there unspoken but perfectly understood. He earned this. You never could. Noelle describes their impact as clean and sharp, like a stiletto sliding between his ribs. The collateral damage is noted, cousins shifting in their seats, suddenly desperate to find a neutral place to look. Their averted eyes tell the whole story. No one wants to be caught in the psychological crossfire. An uncle tries to reset the tone with another round of applause, but the sound withers and dies in the toxic air. Silence returns heavier this time, and in that silence a chair scrapes against the floor. Noelle rises. A different kind of quiet descends then. Not discomfort, but the charged stillness of anticipation. The narrative shifts here. The victim is no longer passive. The scent of blood is in the water, and everyone knows the hunt has just been reversed. I can almost hear it in the report, the deliberate rhythmic tap of her heels across the polished floor, a sound designed to command attention. And then, a calculated silence as her shoes meet the dense fibers of a Persian rug, the sound absorbed, the tension amplified as she comes to a halt. She positions herself with tactical precision directly at her father's side. Then begins the ritual, the placement of 4 distinct objects. Each item is laid down not just anywhere but in the dead center of that pristine white space. The white tablecloth becomes a stage and she places them down slowly, one by one, ensuring every single person is watching. First, the document. Not a copy, but the original power of attorney, the one that governed his health and his wealth. The report notes it was creased, a physical testament to the years it spent folded away in her safe, a silent burden. The second item hits the table, the house keys, their weight carried by an old worn brass ring. This wasn't just any ring. It was a relic from the day he supposedly welcomed her back into the fold, a symbol she was now returning. The third object is the most chilling, a solitary key, the one that unlocks the family's deepest secrets. It grants access not only to the instruments of power in the gun safe, but also to the paper legacy in the document vault. And finally, the fourth item. The fourth. A manila envelope described as thick, heavy with unspoken truths and formally bound with a seal of crimson wax. And on that seal, a final defiant touch, her own initials pressed into the wax, claiming ownership of this moment. She had them. The statement says, "Every eye followed my hands." She was the director of this entire scene. The light from the chandelier above, she notes, caught the red wax, making it shine with an unsettling luster. She compares it to fresh blood, a telling detail. Her gaze then locks with Ben's, a silent, unyielding challenge. And the first word she speaks is, "Congratulations." The irony must have been a blade in the air. She delivered it softly, a whisper meant only for the inner circle, making the threat feel deeply personal. A performance for the few who truly mattered. With her part played, she turns her back to the fallout. She begins to walk a deliberate retreat towards the grand archway, leaving the bomb to tick on the table. And here's the father's reaction, just as she must have predicted. A short, sharp sound breaks the silence. She identifies it as his dismissive laugh, a weapon of condescension he'd used against her for years. It transports her back to being 12 years old, begging for a place on his boat, only to be met with that same belittling sound. He was so certain he understood the gesture, so blinded by his own narrative of her. In his mind, the contents were predictable, a letter of resignation, a surrender. He likely imagined a page stained with tears, a final, broken appeal for forgiveness, a desperate plea. So he reaches for the envelope, the arrogant victor moving to confirm his triumph. He doesn't use a letter opener. He uses his butter knife, a crude domestic tool, to violate her formal seal. There's a violence in the description. He ripped it open. An act of contempt performed in the heart of his lavish dinner party. Right there, amidst the clinking of glasses and the remnants of dessert, the trap was sprung. The first piece of paper slid out. The document slid free, a single sheet of paper that would serve as the detonation pin for this entire family. I can picture his eyes tracking the text, a journey of seconds that stretched into an eternity. The header, formal and innocuous. The second line where the familiar names would have appeared, and then the third, the clause where the world fell away. The sharp, sudden sound of a butter knife striking porcelain. It was a surrender, a physical concession to a truth the mind couldn't yet accept. The blood fled his face, a stark visible retreat of life that I could register clearly from 20 feet away. His gaze snapped up towards me, a silent, desperate question in his eyes. His mouth opened, shaping words that had no sound, and then the silence was shattered by a raw, guttural roar. It was a sound of pure anguish, powerful enough to make the fine crystal on the sideboard tremble in sympathetic vibration. "You've got to be kidding me." The first coherent thought to breach the wall of shock. His wife, the mother, began to rise. Her voice was a lifeline thrown into chaos. "Richard, what is it?" But he couldn't grasp it. He was lost his mind, replaying the words he'd just seen. His entire focus was locked on those papers which were now shaking in his grip. They quivered as if the ink itself was searing hot, the words branded in fire. The echo of that primal scream still seemed to cling to the high ceilings, a ghost of the initial impact. Only then, in that ringing silence, did he manage to find his voice once more. He held the pages out, not like a discovery, but like an accusation, like something profoundly contaminated. And he began to read aloud, forcing the truth into the open air for all to witness. His voice was a ruin, cracking under the dual pressures of white-hot fury and chilling disbelief. 18 months ago, he began, and with that date the trap was set, while I was still in a coma. He detailed the timeline of their vulnerability, painting a picture of a family at its absolute weakest. And Mom was barely conscious from chemotherapy. The perfect moment. A calculated strike when all defenses were down. Then came the architect of the scheme, Noah Quincy, acting under valid. Minnesota, medical and durable financial. The legal dagger, perfectly sharpened and legally sanctioned. Power of attorney transferred. The verb that sealed their fate, not stole, transferred. And the sheer scale of the heist was breathtaking. 98% of all Class A voting shares of Quincy. Medical supply into the Quincy Health. The destination, a vault designed to look like a charity. Foundation, irrevocable trust. That one word, irrevocable, was the final lock on the cage. He had to stop the words catching in his throat, a ragged, difficult swallow against the rising tide of sickness, but he pushed on. The final piece of the conspiracy fell into place. With Lauren Brooks, licensed Minnesota, estate planning attorney appointed sole, the accomplice, the professional who had helped build the trap and turn the key, trustee. I read the next line, and the trap's design becomes chillingly clear. The trust is irrevocable under Minnesota. To Statutes, Section 501C. This wasn't a whim. This was a meticulously crafted legal cage. The document's origin is stated next, and it adds a layer of solemnity. This instrument, dated and notarized at Mayo Clinic, Rochester. A decision made not in a boardroom, but in the sterile quiet of a place where one confronts their own mortality. And then the trigger, effective tonight upon formal notification to all. Financial institutions, the freeze. The word itself sends a shiver down my spine, a financial heart attack induced. Clause activates. The next words are a litany of prohibitions: no transfer sale pledge, or distribution involving prior. Every escape route is being systematically sealed off. Shareholders may occur without trustee consent. A new king had been crowned, and they held the only key. The final lock turns with brutal finality. Any attempt to revoke or amend is void. The witness testimony describes the aftermath. The words didn't just land. They detonated, hanging in the air like the ghost of an explosion. Uncle Ray's expression is described as a mask of pure disbelief, his jaw literally hanging slack. And then the first sound to break the spell, Aunt Linda's champagne flute slipping from a nerveless hand to shatter against the floorboards. A sharp, violent punctuation to the silence. The detail that follows is the most telling. Nobody moved to clean it. Their entire world had just shattered with that glass. The father's composure crumbles next. His hand holding the damning pages trembled so violently the papers rustled like dry leaves. His first words were a rasp of denial against the crushing reality. This can't be legal. It wasn't a question of law, it was the desperate plea of a man who just lost his kingdom. The focus then shifts to another man in the room, Gregory Hayes, the father's college roommate. A board member for 35 years, a relationship built on a lifetime of trust. More than that, he was the gatekeeper, the one who still controlled the company's main banking relationship. At that precise moment, a vibration began against his chest. Technology was about to deliver the coup de grace. He retrieves the phone, a small rectangle of light in the dimming room. The witness notes he looked at the screen and the blood drained from his face, leaving it the stark white. Huge color of printer paper. He softly speaks the father's name, Richard. His voice is barely a whisper as he turns the phone, a gesture of complete and utter defeat. For everyone to see the official seal of their ruin, the U.S. bank alert. The message on the screen was a corporate epitaph, all operating accounts line of credit. Merchant services, everything is frozen. The word hung there. Frozen, just like them. Effective at the stroke of midnight. The justification I read was a formal notice from the trust that had just landed like a bomb in the hands of their own legal team, a calculated, perfectly timed strike, and then the first casualty. The mother lets out a sound that wasn't human, more like the cry of a trapped thing, and simply crumples sideways from her chair. A total system failure. Two relatives, their reflexes kicking in, managed to intercept her just before she met the unforgiving floor. Ben, however, moves with a different energy, springing to his feet, his face contorting as his gaze locked onto me, still positioned, observing by the archway. His voice rips through the stunned silence. "What in God's name did you do?" he roared, the tendons in his neck straining against his skin like taut cables. I offered no reply. I didn't have to. My silence was its own confession, and the papers in their hands were narrating the rest of the tragedy for me. The father's eyes scanned the pages, his voice climbing in pitch and volume. With each devastating paragraph he uncovered, the legal jargon was a death sentence. Contingent beneficiary upon trustee discretion. The words hung in the air, a declaration of their powerlessness. Quincy Health Systems, LLC. He read, a Minnesota entity established 3 years prior for the express purpose of... He stops, looking up, his eyes wide with a terrible dawning realization. You built a whole other empire, with whose money... But he didn't pause for my answer. He didn't need one. He knew exactly whose sweat and sleepless nights had funded this secret betrayal. Gregory interjected, his voice a low, desperate murmur. Rich, I just spoke with our guy at the bank, our relationship manager. His next words sealed their fate. The freeze is absolute, ironclad. They won't even release the funds for tomorrow's payroll run without the new trustee's sign-off. He choked on the words. We're locked out. At that, one of the wives began to weep, a quiet, muffled sound of despair into her dinner napkin. The minister could only stare down at his meal as if the concept of salmon had become utterly foreign to him. And then, the final break, Ben lunged. A sudden, violent lunge across the polished wood, and the first casualty of the confrontation was a glass of water, a clumsy, desperate move. I can picture it now, the crisp sound of shattering crystal, the desperate scrabble of his fingers clawing for the documents that held his entire world. The man they called Dad was no longer a father. He was a cornered animal. But the response was quicker, a surgeon's precision, yanking the file back, pulling it tight against the chest. It became a shield. Not just paper, but a testament to a final irreversible act, as if letting go would somehow rewind time and erase the ink. The illusion of their power was already gone, and so the first volley was fired, a question thick with the poison of betrayal. You think you can just steal my... company. The word finally escaped his throat, raw and ragged, a shout aimed not at a business partner but at his own child, followed by the oldest weapon in the parental arsenal, guilt. After everything we gave you. And here the transcript notes a shift, a pause. Then a voice cuts through the chaos, not with anger, but with something far more chilling. The witness described it as calm and flat, the sound of a lock clicking into place. You signed the power of attorney. A simple statement of fact devoid of all emotion. You signed it yourself. The emphasis on the you must have felt like a dagger. Then the turn of the knife, your wife signed it. On the very same day. And this is the legal checkmate, the move from which there is no escape. Both of you were lucid enough, and to know exactly what it said, and then the final nail invoking the cold impersonal power of the state itself. Minnesota law doesn't grant you the luxury of regret. There's no clause written for second thoughts, just because you changed your mind later. The statement lands with the finality of a gavel. The report mentions the mother, a crumpled figure by the table, the sound not a cry but a whimper, the sound of a ghost watching its own haunting. Her words were a fragile shield against the brutal truth. We thought you were helping us. The pause says it all, not robbing us. A long silence is noted here, a gaze held for just a second too long, filled with a history I can only begin to imagine. And then the correction. Not a denial, but a devastating reframing of reality. I was helping you survive. The final, quiet blow. You just became so accustomed to the life raft you forgot to notice who was rowing to keep you alive. That last word, alive, was still echoing when another player, Ben, made his move, a sudden, percussive slam of both palms on the table. It was a hollow display of impotent fury. "We'll sue," he declared into the silence. "We will fight this." Empty threats against a fortress of legal paperwork. But the fight was already over before it began. Every single page bore the signature of Lauren Brooks, a name synonymous with ironclad corporate law. And beside it, the embossed, irrefutable seal of the Minnesota Secretary of State, a symbol of absolute bureaucratic finality. It was all there in black and white, the entire strategy centered around a single brutal word, irrevocable. A word that meant exactly what it said. Every legal mind in that room, even their own, understood the game was already over. They knew. The transcript notes their own attorney Gregory simply shaking his head, a slow, mournful gesture of utter defeat. That single motion was the signal. The father, the patriarch, seemed to physically deflate, sinking back into his expensive chair. The witness described it perfectly, like a marionette whose strings had just been severed. All the fight, all the fire extinguished in an instant. And then the document, as the very prize he'd lunged for, slid from his grasp, his fingers suddenly nerveless and weak. They fanned out across the white linen tablecloth, a cascade of black ink and broken promises scattering among the dinnerware. One page, the report concludes, drifted down to land squarely in a small pool of melted butter, the ink beginning to bleed, the final greasy stain on a ruined legacy. The grand chandelier hung above a silent crystalline witness, its light spilling down, casting a merciless glare upon the 22 faces that were just beginning to comprehend. In that cold light, a terrible truth dawned: the empire they had gathered to toast. This kingdom, built on legacy and handshakes, had slipped through their fingers. And then came the first tremor, a chorus of electronic alerts, a digital death knell before the catering staff had even managed to clear away the last of the dessert plates. I watched Gregory's screen ignite, first a single point of light in the growing darkness. Another sterile bank notification followed by his father's phone, and then another, a contagion spreading. It rippled through every board member who still carried the company's digital leash on their person, the company app on their phones. On every single device, the same crimson warning, a banner that screamed 2 words, access revoked. And beneath it, a final twist of the knife, trust freeze in effect. I saw Aunt Linda, a portrait of panicked denial, snatch her coat from the chair, murmuring a flimsy excuse about the morning coming too soon. Uncle Ray, his glass of expensive port left unfinished, a small forgotten tragedy on the table, simply followed her, a man suddenly adrift, his world capsized in an instant. In a matter of minutes, the elegant circular driveway became a chaotic ballet of reversing taillights, a frantic unspoken retreat. No one dared to say a word. Not a single goodbye was uttered. And just as the last car vanished into the night, the official execution order, disguised as an email from the Coleman Regional Health Network, arrived, silently landing in the inboxes of the executive distribution list. The subject line itself was a masterpiece of cold corporate finality. Selection of vendor for enterprise-wide operating system. A verdict they were just now reading. A verdict I had been savoring for the past hour. Coleman, the prize. A network of 18 hospitals spread across the heart of Minnesota and deep into western Wisconsin. A $62 million contract. The one they spoke of in hushed, confident tones. The one that was already theirs. That contract had been awarded to a company named Quincy Health Systems. My company. A ghost entity I had willed into existence, registering the name in a patois, sterile, tiny WeWork office in downtown Minneapolis a mere 3 weeks before this night. The digital breadcrumb trail begins years ago with a timestamp indicating the witching hour, a lone figure coding in the silence. I can almost hear the faint rhythmic hum from the factory floor below, a ghost of industry still operating. The phrase leaps from the page, cold and mechanical, stamped out ventilators. Not built, not crafted, stamped, like a machine pressing metal devoid of humanity. And the location, under the old. The word hangs there, a ghost, under the old regime's forgotten laws, or literally beneath the decaying foundations of a world that was supposed to be gone. And then the email. It's a masterclass in corporate execution, concise, lethally polite. The opening line is a piece of carefully crafted fiction after exhaustive evaluation. I wonder what that evaluation really looked like. The next line reads like a press release for a public hanging. Coleman Regional Health Network is proud to announce our partnership with Quincy Health Systems LLC. And there it is, the tell, not medical supply, a different Quincy, a corporate doppelganger. They were being replaced by a vision of the future, all full AI-driven. And patient flow, supply chain, and revenue cycle management. It was a complete lexicon of their own obsolescence. The final sentence was the date of their execution. Implementation begins Q1. I have the deposition transcripts. I can see the father reading those words aloud, his voice lost in the sudden emptiness of their family dining room, a voice they said that had become a hollowed-out shell. Ben couldn't just listen. He had to see it. He seized the phone, his eyes scanning the words, and then came the explosion of grief and rage hurling the device. It was a collision of two worlds, the sleek smartphone shattering against the unyielding stone of the family fireplace. The crime scene photos show it all, a confetti of glass and the dark smear of lithium batteries strewn across the hearth. The timeline accelerates. At 8:17 the following morning, the contagion of disaster spreads to the employees. Every single member of the Quincy medical supply staff, from the front office to the loading dock, received an identical, chillingly impersonal mass text from Human Resources. The justification was a masterpiece of corporate deflection due to unforeseen banking restrictions. And then the words that stopped every heart: payroll processing for the current period has been suspended. Suspended, a word designed to drain hope, not extinguish it all at once. That final empty promise, further updates to follow, was a ghost they would all be chasing. By 9 o'clock, the internal communication channels were a wildfire of fear. The factory WhatsApp groups were incandescent. I've archived the images. Forklift drivers, men who had worked there for decades, posting photos of the front gates, wrapped in thick industrial chains secured by the bank's repossession team. The end had been made brutally physical. Then the public breakdown. The head of accounting, a woman they all knew, started a live stream, broadcasting her own devastation, tears carving paths through her makeup with the useless building looming behind her. The reason for her broadcast: a notification from her bank. Her direct deposit, her lifeline, had just bounced. In the midst of this vortex, the man they paid to protect them, the family's lawyer for a generation. Tom Erickson finally answered his phone. The call logs show it was the father's 19th desperate attempt. The call. The witness statement says every word bled through the study door sharp and clear. It was a hollow apology, the kind that precedes a professional execution. "Richard, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Then came the justification, the cold clinical phrase, conflict of interest. The lawyer, a woman named Lauren Brooks, was switching sides. The report reads she was now on retainer with the trust. The very entity Richard was fighting had co-opted his own counsel. A checkmate. "I can't represent you against it," she'd said. It was a formal declaration of abandonment. He was being cast out. The statement concludes her part with a final dismissive piece of advice: find new counsel. Then the sound of this call ending a single sharp click. The son Ben didn't storm off. The witness says he disappeared upstairs. A fuse had been lit. And 10 minutes passed. A silent simmering 10 minutes before the first sound of violence echoed through the house, splintering wood. It was followed by the unmistakable crash of shattering glass, a sound the witness describes as raining down from above. The chaos originated from the second floor, a storm breaking directly over their heads. The mother's reaction was immediate, instinctual. She ran towards the danger, screaming Ben's name, a plea mixed with terror. Then, a sickening thud as something massive impacted the hallway runner, shaking the very frame of the house. Only later did they identify the object, a mahogany dresser, heavy and solid. The notes here add a poignant detail. It was a graduation gift from his mother. a symbol of a future now being torn apart. And the father, he was frozen. The witness describes him sitting on the bottom step, his head buried in his hands, a statue of pure defeat. His gaze was fixed on the scattered pages of the trust agreement, the very documents that had just detonated his life. It was as if he was looking at them for the first time, trying to decipher a script written in an alien language. From this incomprehensible text, he began muttering numbers, fragments of the disaster. 96 million, 62 million. The numbers tumbled out, followed by the more grounded immediate terrors, the mortgage balance, and then the most intimate wound of all, his wife's medical bills, a debt that was still growing, all of it still coming due. And where was our witness in all this, standing in the kitchen, a spectator to their own family's implosion? They mentioned drinking coffee. They couldn't even taste a mundane act performed in the epicenter of a cataclysm. From that vantage point, they watched what they called their empire finally bleed out on the hallway floor. The collapse wasn't slow, it was happening in real time, and by noon, the private agony became public record, hitting the Star Tribune. The story was already live on their website. The speed suggests the news didn't just leak, it was pushed. The witness speculates someone at the Coleman Company must have leaked the vendor announcement. Simultaneously, someone inside the bank must have leaked the financial details. It was a coordinated attack culminating in the asset freeze. The resulting headline was, in the witness's own words, merciless. I pulled the archive. Minneapolis medical supply giant locked out. Out overnight. New AI startup takes its place. A corporate assassination executed with digital precision. The words on the page read, crowning contract. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a coronation. And in the middle of this silent triumph, a vibration. A different kind of notification. It wasn't from his family upstairs. The document continues, series. B term sheet from a Silicon Valley fund. So the gears were already turning on a much larger machine. This was never just about the family. This was about an empire. He'd been in quiet negotiations for 6 months. 6 months. I traced the timeline back in my head. This entire implosion was meticulously planned, a controlled demolition. The investors had just raised their offer. The document is clear about the reason. The valuation was boosted by the Coleman win. So the family's legal defeat wasn't the end goal, it was leverage. A proof of concept to his new partners. His response to the life-changing news, I read the line, I accepted the congratulations with a thumbs-up emoji and turned the screen off. The casual, chilling detachment of it. A digital gesture to seal a fortune while his family's world shattered just a floor above. The narrative shifts upstairs. Ben, his brother, had reportedly punched through the drywall. The first sounds of the fallout raw and violent. And then the rage collapsing into grief as he was found sobbing on the landing. A complete unraveling. Their mother, according to his account, attempted to comfort him, a desperate, instinctual act. She tried to hold him like she did when he was 9 after a hockey injury. He's recalling this detail. He's contrasting a fixable physical pain with the incurable wound he just inflicted. The response was brutal. He shoved her. The physical rejection of the last bastion of comfort. The force was significant enough to make her stumble into the banister. The violence was no longer just emotional. And the father, the patriarch, the statement says he didn't move. Paralyzed, he didn't rush to his wife's side. His eyes were glued to something else. He was staring at a single paragraph in the trust document, the very weapon used against them. The clause was written in plain, inescapable English, no room for interpretation. It confirmed that not one single share could ever be reclaimed. The finality is absolute. Citing Minnesota law, he describes it as ironclad final. He had used the system itself to build the cage. A silence fell over the house then, but it wasn't peace. It was the quiet of utter defeat. A silence punctuated only by the sounds of breaking things and his mother's whispered broken pleas. Amidst this symphony of despair, his actions are jarringly mundane. He set his empty mug in the sink. Then he picked up a small overnight bag. A bag. This tells me everything. He'd packed it 2 days earlier. He knew this storm was coming. He had not just weathered it, he had summoned it, and he was ready for his exit. He walked out the front door without uttering a single word. A ghost leaving his own haunting. The cold November air tasted like freedom. He calls it freedom. I see the bars of the cage he left behind with his family still inside. The timeline jumps forward 9 months. The evidence of the aftermath is a for sale sign. In front of the Adina house, the sign was sun-bleached and leaning, a perfect metaphor for the family itself, weathered, broken, and abandoned. The final line is a name, the Old Quincy Medical Supply, the origin point, the heart of the empire and the root of its destruction. I pull up the property records, a satellite image time-stamped last spring, and there it is, or rather, there it isn't. The sign on County Road 18. The family name that stood for decades had vanished. In its place, something temporary, almost insulting in its genericness, had been staked into the lawn. A single stark word blazoned on a cheap banner, auction. Beneath it, the cold finality of 3 more words. Everything must go. The bankruptcy file confirms the timeline. Chapter 11. A desperate attempt to restructure lasted precisely 11 weeks. The irony is not lost on me. 11 weeks before the house of cards collapsed entirely. The creditors I see from the filings were like sharks circling. They must have sensed the desperation the very second those bank statements were entered into the public record. The numbers on the docket told a story of hemorrhage of a slow bleed that had suddenly become a torrent. The judge, seeing no path forward, converted it to a Chapter 7 liquidation with a speed that must have felt like a guillotine. Faster than anyone in that family could have possibly prepared for. By June, the dream was being sold for parts. I can almost hear the echoing silence of the factory floor as the machines were cataloged, sold off in lots to some faceless distributor. The manifest says they were shipped out of Chicago. The heart of the company ripped out and sent away. Even the office furniture, the desks where futures were planned, was auctioned off to a startup incubator for what amounts to pocket change. Pennies on the dollar. And just like that, the company, the entity that had once been a pillar of this community, the one that had provided a living for 90 people in these northwest suburbs. It was erased from existence as if it had never been there at all. The next domino to fall, according to the mortgage filings, was the house. It took just 5 months after that first missed payment. The first sign that the corporate failure had breached the walls of their home. A crucial detail jumps out from the deed. The mortgage was solely in the parents' names. The family trust, their supposed safety net, was never tied to the real estate. A fatal oversight. U.S. Bank didn't hesitate. The foreclosure was filed in Hennepin County District Court. The case file is thin. They won by default. No one even showed up to fight it. They had already surrendered. The sheriff's sale was held on a Tuesday morning in August, a mundane end to a generational home. Just another name on a list of foreclosures. I find the buyer's information in the county clerk's records, a young couple. They drove up from Eden Prairie, saw a bargain, and bought a life's worth of memories. The sale price is listed right here, 62 cents on the dollar. A steal built on the wreckage of another family. And then the final modern cruelty. They posted the closing photos to Instagram smiling with the keys. The same week, their feed was filled with updates, new quartz counters, a fresh coat of gray paint. Every post was another layer of erasure, burying any trace of the family that had lived and breathed within those walls. 27 years of history painted over in a weekend. And Ben. The toxicology report is the last page in this file. He lasted 73 days on the outside. 73 days after losing everything, the coroner's findings are unequivocal. He tested positive for fentanyl. The final cost of it all. I'm looking at the timeline, and here's the first fracture, his initial attempt to reach his mother. It happened just 2 weeks after the eviction notice was served. The pressure was already immense. The next entry in the file is a dispatch from the Minneapolis PD. They found him. The report paints a bleak picture, asleep at the wheel of a stolen Civic, a single backpack, his only possession. Inside that backpack, a cocktail of pills. The system's response was predictable. A public defender was assigned. A deal was struck. 18 months at the Lino Lakes Correctional Facility. The sentence came with a rider mandatory chemical dependency treatment. A label, a box to be checked. I can almost hear the scene described in the social worker's notes, the mother's breakdown as the cuffs clicked shut. But it's the father's absence that hangs in the air. He didn't even show up to the courthouse. With their son gone, the parents vanished into the city, resurfacing in a cramped one-bedroom unit. It was located above a laundromat in St. Louis Park. A life lived to the rhythm of spinning machines. Second floor south-facing. Every detail a testament to their diminished world. The rent was $1,180 a month, but at least the heat was included. Now I'm looking at their income statements. The father's Social Security, and his early retirement pension. The combined total was a shocking $416. The math simply doesn't work. The mother's health was another battlefront managed by a Medicare Advantage plan. It covered the bulk of her maintenance chemotherapy, a fragile lifeline. But the fine print was a killer. The copays devoured half of every single check they received. Their grocery budget was entirely dependent on SNAP benefits. They were living on the margins. And this detail from an intake form chills me. They kept the thermostat set to 62 degrees to survive. Which brings me to the legal fight. Every single lawsuit they filed was destined to fail in the same way. I've counted 3 distinct attempts. The first was in state court, a desperate opening move. The grounds were undue influence. When that failed, they tried federal court. There they alleged a breach of fiduciary duty, a more serious, more difficult claim to prove. Their final act was an emergency motion, a plea to the court to simply dissolve the trust. But every judge in every court returned to the same immovable obstacle. It all hinged on those 2 documents, the medical and financial powers of attorney. They were executed at a time when both grantors were certified as having full legal capacity. The signatures were witnessed by Mayo Clinic staff, the gold standard of credibility, and everything was notarized, sealing their fate with an official indifferent stamp, and officially entered into the record. I read the words again. The state of Minnesota, it seems, has no legal framework for a change of heart. No clause that allows for the revocation of a choice based on regret. The file closes with 2 final blows. Case dismissed with prejudice, and the order for attorney, fees to be paid by the plaintiff. In the margins, a note, my father aged a full decade in the span of those 9 months. His hair, once peppered with gray, became a stark uniform, white. The golf clubs gathered dust. The silence in the house thickened as he stopped taking calls even from the old friends who were just trying to check in. I picture him some mornings a ghost in a bathrobe sitting on that small concrete balcony, his gaze lost and empty, fixed on the asphalt of the parking lot until the last light of the sun finally bled from the sky. And my mother, she made a single attempt to bridge the chasm. A new Gmail account, a name I didn't recognize, was her ghost in the machine, and she sent one solitary message typed, I imagine, under the fluorescent hum of a public library. The words were a skeleton of their former selves. We're sorry. Please come see us. We have nothing left. It was a confession of absolute defeat. I offered no reply. That desperate plea was delivered to a digital inbox whose existence I terminated that very same week. The last time my car's headlights swept across the facade of that old house, I saw that strangers, the new owners, had already begun to write their own stories there with Halloween decorations and eerie glowing skeletons staked into the front lawn. There were festive orange lights tangled in the branches of the trees I once believed were mine. The porch, a place so sacred in my memory where Ben and I wobbled on our first bikes, now hosted a generic welcome mat, a placeholder for a life that announced home sweet home in cheerful, almost mocking block letters. I didn't slow down, I just kept driving. And now today I find myself standing on the 42nd floor of the Capella Tower, a spire of glass and steel in downtown Minneapolis, and I watch the same familiar light dance and shatter across the surface of Lake Calhoun, exactly the way it did when I was just a kid riding my bike believing home was forever. He starts with a memory, a ghost of a simpler time, cycling around a lake in the summer. It's a deliberate placement, a stark contrast to the sterile world he inhabits now. And there it is, the barrier. A wall of glass reflecting a man he's built from scratch, branded with the emblem of his new kingdom. He recites the company name Quincy Health Systems, and its ticker QHS, not like a CEO, but like a man reciting the name that saved his life. We rang the bell 4 months ago. The we is a performance. Everything about him screams isolation. 4 months, he's counting the days of his new life starting from 0. He quantifies his escape, putting a precise number on his freedom, $1.9 billion. That figure isn't just wealth, it's the exact cost to bury a past. And the stocks climb. That's the distance he's putting between himself and the wreckage. Every point gained is another mile he's run. His domain is measured in square footage, half a floor. A self-made king in a glass castle ruling over an empire of his own design. The details are a confession. Floor-to-ceiling windows to watch the world from a safe distance. White oak as clean and unblemished as he wishes he could be. A single orchid on the credenza, a living thing but sterile, cultivated, and alone. Then the most telling detail, the absence of history. No photos on the walls, no family. This isn't minimalism, it's a systematic erasure, a declaration of war on memory itself. And then he names the demons. Adina, the hospital. The words hang in the air, the source code of all this pain and ambition. He's haunted by sensory ghosts, the feel of hospital recliners, the sterile, inescapable smell of antiseptic, and the core wound betrayal. His reaction was not to heal but to amputate. He began systematically dismantling his own life. The timeline is critical. The week I walked out. The escape was immediate, decisive. A new phone, a new email, each one a door slammed shut. The purge was absolute. New accounts, blocking every cousin, severing every link in the chain that connected him to them. He even targeted high school friends not for who they were, but for the information they held, the memories they carried. The memory of his mom's landline becomes a threat, a password to a life he has sealed away. So he hires a guard, an assistant, a human firewall. Not one message has made it through, he says with the cold satisfaction of a successful siege. But the fortress walls are porous. At night, the ghost gets in. He admits to a ritual, a compulsion he can't control. He haunts his own past through Zillow, a digital specter visiting the crime scene of his former life. He calls it habit. It's an obsession. He watches the evidence of his existence being painted over, updated, cycled through every few months. New furniture, new paint. Each change is another confirmation that the world moved on, that his erasure was successful. He torments himself with images of strangers smiling and happy in rooms that were once the backdrop to his life. He finds a dark, detached humor in the machine that tracks him, the algorithm. It sees a potential buyer, a man interested in property values and square footage. It can't see the truth. He's a warden checking the locks on a prison he built for his own memories, making sure the past is still dead. I never went back. A simple sentence, but it's a vow. He lists the sacred days he defied. Not for Christmas, not for his own father's birthday. Each missed celebration was a brick he placed in his wall. And then the final confession, the ultimate test of his exile. Not even when Ben, his own brother, fell for the second time. The call log shows it started with a social worker from Hennepin County. I see the purpose of the call noted here, a clinical detached search for the medical center's next of kin. Her statement says she let it ring, a deliberate choice to let the connection sever until the voicemail finally surrendered. She anticipates the question before it's even asked. Do you feel guilty? It's the reporters, she notes, always the reporters hunting for a confession. They crave the performance of remorse, the tears, or at the very least a silence pregnant with meaning. They want to cast her in a role, the wayward daughter who forged an entire empire from the embers of a grudge and now must battle the ghosts of her own making. But she denies them this. She clarifies that it's not guilt she feels, but it isn't the thrill of victory either. Revenge, in her words, tastes like nothing but ash after that first fleeting moment. What she feels instead is a profound stillness, a quiet she calls it. The kind of deep internal silence that can only be earned when a long tormenting noise inside your own mind finally ceases its screaming. Her testimony is clear. She was the one who kept the company breathing when everyone else had left it for dead. She quantifies the cost: 5 years of sleepless nights, a crucible from which she forged software that could foresee patient readmissions with a staggering 94% accuracy, a system now vital to 18 different hospital networks. She built something from nothing. She created 380 stable jobs in a city that had long since resigned itself to the sight of old factory gates succumbing to rust. She details her philanthropy: 2 free clinics established in North Minneapolis, a calculated tribute bearing her mother's maiden name. And here's the crucial detail. She did it because she possessed the power to do so, not because she was seeking some form of maternal approval or gratitude. This, she insists, is the part the outside world, the strangers, can never seem to grasp. This entire saga wasn't about a hostile takeover, about stripping something away from another person. It was about a resolute refusal to let the sum of her immense sacrifices be mounted on a wall as someone else's unearned, undeserved trophy. She notes that she still signs legal documents with the name Noel Quincy, a necessity dictated by the SEC, but confesses the name itself now feels alien, a relic from a former life. It begins with a confession of alienation, describing a name as if it were an ill-fitting costume, a borrowed coat. It's not just a name they don't use, it's a skin they've shed. The silence around this name is a key piece of the puzzle. The words out loud to another human being tell me this is a sacred self-imposed vow. And the timeline clicks into place over a year since the cataclysm. Now, I see the new identity. They've constructed a single letter, a cipher, the letter Q. They've prepared a defense for it, a rehearsed line for when the curious pry into the meaning of this new initial. The answer they give is quiet. But it's more than a word. It's a doctrine born from a wound. They say some lessons are expensive, and I can almost feel the weight of what it costs them. They frame the trauma as a curriculum, the pain as tuition. And now, the first rule of their new hardened existence begins to surface. Never give more than you can afford to lose. I read the line twice. This isn't about money. This is the sound of a soul that was bled dry. The second rule follows sharp and cold. Never mistake tolerance for forgiveness. This hints at a long period of enduring something of gritting their teeth while the betrayal took root. And the third rule, the one that truly exposes the source of the pain, never assume the people who need you today. It's a chilling indictment of those they once supported. Will remember you tomorrow. The finality of it is absolute. They were used and discarded. And now the story shifts from philosophy to the specific event that broke them. The perpetrators are simply they, a faceless collective enemy. The moment of betrayal is replayed when they attempted to hand over their life's work, not a project but a legacy, their entire purpose given to someone who wasn't there for the struggle. The imagery is so visceral, so raw, when it was bleeding. This creation was born from their own suffering, their own sacrifice, and they alone bore witness to it. And this is the turning point. The victim didn't just mourn, they armed themselves. They realized the law itself could be forged into a weapon. The key was their willingness to wield it to do what was necessary to step into the cold calculus of retribution, while everyone else is busy clapping. The image is staggering. The theft happened in plain sight, masked by applause. A public coronation that was in reality a public execution of their past life. And so the creed of this new person is declared no forgiveness, no looking back. The past is a sealed tomb. Finally, it all comes full circle. They will no longer carry their name into the future. It wasn't just a family name, it belonged to the betrayers. This wasn't a name change, it was an exorcism.